Hello. Today we are going to be looking at what a libertarian is and what capitalism does in an unrestricted capitalist society. So we looked at capitalism and the basics of capitalism in our last lesson, and now we're going to be looking at how does capitalism work if it's allowed to play out over multiple generations with very few rules and regulations, right? So the question really is, how free is a free market? Now, in a free market, are there rules? Yes, absolutely there are rules. But in a free market, you want basically kind of as few rules and regulations as possible. That's what we call an unrestricted capitalist system. So there still have to be some rules to get the market to work at all, but as few regulations, right? And we're going to look at how far down can you really pare that down? What are the minimum number of regulations that you can really have? Okay? So before we jump into that and talk about libertarians, I want to talk about liberalism, because we've talked about this root word liberal, right? You're going to see it in the word libertarian, but a libertarian is a particular kind of liberal, and this can get confusing. We talked about this, the idea of liberalism back in when we were doing the Enlightenment. What do liberals believe in? And again, I'm not talking about Democrats versus Republicans in the United States system here. I'm talking about liberalism as a political philosophy. What does that mean? Hopefully you recall that liberals are anybody who believe in individual rights. It doesn't matter what specifically those rights are. If you have somebody who believes that individuals have rights, even if it's just one right, that makes them a liberal. And obviously that means there's a lot of different kinds of liberals. There's a lot of different ways you can go about that. In the United States, we talked about how really every political party in the US is a liberal party. And it gets confusing because people in the United States talk about Democrats as liberals and then Republicans as conservatives. But really both Democrats and Republicans are liberals in that they both believe in individual rights. Republicans believe in giving individuals rights to do what they want, basically, so have very few rules telling them what they can and can't do, generally speaking. And so that means like a smaller government and the right to own a gun and basically few regulations, right? On the other hand, you have the Democrats who also believe in rights for individuals, the right to marry who you want, the right to have a good education, whether or not you can afford it, right? The right to get health care even if you're poor, right? So they both believe in rights. So they're both liberal parties, okay? Even though in the United States we have this very specific meaning. When we say liberal, people think Democrat. But from a political philosophy standpoint, that's not really accurate, okay? Because both the Democrats and the Republicans believe in individual rights. They just have a different way of looking at what those rights are and which ones are the more important ones. The reason I'm bringing this up is because we're going to add even more confusion to this when we start talking about libertarians. So this is just like a political spectrum of different kinds of parties around the world, really. Because in the United States, we don't really have a communist party. So here you have like the dead middle right here, the dead center. Liberals are over here, conservatives over here. And again, that doesn't mean Democrats and Republicans. Really, in the United States today, Democrats are actually kind of over here. They've kind of moved to the right, and then our Republicans would kind of be over here with what we call conservatives. But again, they still both believe in individual rights. And then to the right of both of them, here we have libertarians. And they're the ones we're really going to be focusing on today because they have a lot to do with what we're looking at this period in history in the 1800s. So a lot of people complain about the government. Democrats and Republicans both complain about governments. Your parents or guardians have probably muttered about politicians or parties or whatever. And Libertarians also don't like the idea of having big governments, right? Democrats are more comfortable, or Democrats over here are more comfortable, and people on this side of the spectrum are more comfortable with big governments because they think government can do good things for people. They can provide public schooling or healthcare and coordinate lots of big projects and things like that. People on the right side tend to like, left versus right, I'm not saying they're correct. People on the right side of the spectrum, to the right, believe in having, well, usually smaller governments, although our fascists over here are an exception to that, which we will get to in a couple weeks. But the bottom line here is we have these libertarians over here, okay? They're to the right of both the liberals and the conservatives, the Democrats and the Republicans right here. And libertarians don't like the idea of having a big government, right? So with all these complaints about government, I want you to think about what a government should look like if you could only keep two parts of the government, right? So I want you to come up with two parts of the government that you would keep if you could only keep two. And before you jump in and say, oh, I would keep, the president. Okay, that's fine. But the government is made up of a lot of different parts, right? So public school teachers, those are government employees. Public schools is a part of the government. Policemen are part of the government. That's different than the army, right? The army is supposed to protect outside the country, right, and keep the country safe from outside invasions, whereas the policemen are supposed to serve and protect the people in the country. And it can be very dangerous to use the army as your police force, because then you run the risk of turning your own people into the enemy, right? So that's why we have separate groups. You have the fire department, that's part of the government. Health inspectors are part of the government. Safety inspectors, the FDA, the CIA, and the FBI. The courts are part of the government. Congress writes the laws, right? But then, you have the president, but under the president, you have all these different groups that enforce those laws. So you have the housing authority. So there's all kinds of different things that the government does, right? Setting speed limits, right? That's a law that gets passed, but that's a government job. So if you could only keep two parts of the government, only two, which two would those be and why? That's probably a pretty tough question for you to answer, because there's always these trade-offs, and it's hard, having grown up in a system where the government does do so much. Even if we're not thinking about the fact that it's the government doing these things, it does do a lot. Giving those things up can be, difficult to think about what you would really prioritize. And the reason I ask such a tough question is because, again, we're going to be talking about libertarians today, and a true libertarian wants a really small government, very small. And really, ideally for a libertarian, they want the government to only have two parts. And those two parts would be the army, but the army would be very small, right? Not a big army that you have to pay a lot of taxes to support, but a small army that its only job is to protect the borders of the country. So you're not going to be using your army to intervene in like foreign wars that are far away that don't threaten your country's borders. You're not going to send your army out to do like humanitarian missions in other countries. That's not a thing, okay? It's just for protection for libertarians. And then the other part is that they would keep a court system, specifically to enforce contracts and property law. So making sure that if you signed a contract, you actually follow through, that nobody's making a business deal where they agree to pay for something and then they get the thing and then they don't pay for it, right? So courts would be dedicated to property law and contracts. Okay? So with such an extremely small government, right, that means you're going to have really low taxes because you don't have to pay for anything else. You're not paying for public education. You're not paying for public roads. You don't have to pay for any of that stuff. So very low taxes, right? Because to a libertarian, the government's purpose, the sole purpose of the government is to protect individuals' property, right? So a libertarian, they're a kind of liberal, right? They believe in individual rights. But the most important right to a libertarian is basically the right to property. And then the liberty comes with that. The liberty part of libertarian it's that libertarians want the liberty to do whatever they want with whatever they own, right? So you have the right as an individual to own stuff, and you can do whatever you want with that stuff. Okay? So here you're not going to have a lot of laws telling you what you can and cannot do, really. The laws deal with property law. So what kinds of policies would a libertarian like or not like? Okay? Well, a libertarian, for example, is not going to like a law that tells you that you can't do drugs, right? Because for a libertarian, why would they not want a law that says you can't do drugs? Well, because a couple reasons. Number one, for a libertarian, you own you, right? You own yourself. That's part of your own property. So if it's your own body, you should be able to do whatever you want with it. So that would mean that you would get to put in your body whatever you want. You could also get tattoos and ear piercings and do your hair however you want, but you could also take whatever you want, right? Medication, you don't have to take medication. You don't have to go to the doctor if you don't want to. You can take drugs if you want to take drugs. Ms. Greco is not encouraging you to take drugs. Please, I am not saying that you should take drugs. What I'm saying is libertarians would argue that there shouldn't be rules against taking drugs. Also, how do you get drugs? Well, you pay for them. So if it's your money, you should get to pay for whatever you want to buy, and so you should be able to do that, right? So the government shouldn't be able to tell you what you can and cannot spend your money on, and what you can and cannot do with your own body. Again, please don't do drugs. Okay. Obviously, this could cause problems because drug addicts, can do bad things. But a libertarian would say they have the liberty to do that. Okay. And then if bad stuff happens as a result, well, we have a court system to deal with that. But on the same token, a libertarian would be pro-choice, right? Because if it's your body, you should be able to control how or whether or not you reproduce and what happens to your body, right? So a woman should not be forced to have a child that she does not want. It's her DNA that's being reproduced. It's her body that's being used to create this new human. So she should have the ability to decide whether or not she wants that, right? They want as few restrictions and limitations as possible on what people can do with their property, and that includes their own bodies. So, for example, a libertarian would, well, okay, so I guess I should say this gets a little weird because, well, not weird, but like confusing because on our spectrum, libertarians are over here. So you would think that they would agree with our Republicans a lot and our Democrats not very much because they're farther on to this side. But because of their ideology, they actually have commonalities with the Democrats and with the Republicans. So you're going to see policies, for example, a libertarian would not want welfare programs, right? So welfare programs are things like food stamps and Medicare and Medicaid, government services that help the poor, right? A libertarian doesn't want those things because that would be a growth of the government, and it costs tax money, right? You have to have taxes to pay for those things. So they don't want that, and the Republicans would agree with them. But then on the other hand, libertarians would agree with the Democrats when it comes to allowing same-sex marriage, for example, because that marriage fundamentally, right, is a property contract. It's literally a contract you sign with, and lets the government know that, hey, you two are now basically one unit, and that you, like, all your stuff basically is shared. That's why if you don't want that to happen, you have to actually create a separate document called a prenup, and you actually say, okay, well, we're getting married, but this stuff's mine and this stuff is the other person's. And so a libertarian would say, well, hey, it's your property, so you should get to decide who to share it with. That's totally up to you. As well as just the liberty, again, of living your life how you want to. So that's what libertarians, the guiding principle is, again, this liberty to do what you want with what you own. Okay, and so I think it's summed up nicely in this little sign here. Libertarians, I want gay married couples to be able to protect their marijuana plants with guns, right? So again, this kind of liberty to own things, to do what you want with your property, to live your life the way you want to with as few regulations as possible, except, of course, you have to honor property contracts. Now, it's very popular for college kids to think they're all libertarians because, it's a very popular idea that they want to smoke marijuana and Okay, so again, you can definitely go to college without smoking marijuana. In fact, please, not only do not do drugs, but if you're going to smoke marijuana in a state where it's legal, please wait until you're at least 25 years old, when your brain has stopped developing, and so that the addiction-prone centers of your brain will not be primed to get addicted to more harmful substances. That's your PSA for today, okay? But if you want to be a libertarian, great, that's fine. You can totally do that. You can sign up for that political party and support its goals, but you should know what else you're getting involved in. It's not a political party that's whole goal is to just legalize marijuana, okay? There's other stuff going on here, and you should be aware of that. And it's relevant to our study in history because we're going to see these kinds of ideas in history. So, part of the reason the libertarians want such a small government is because, yes, they want the liberty to do what they want with what they own, so that would mean having very few rules and regulations, but also because they really hate taxes, okay? In the libertarian mindset, taxes are basically theft, right? Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, taxes are the money that people give to the government, and then the government uses it to do stuff, right? Like to fund the army, or fund NASA, or pay for public schools, whatever, right? But you have to give a certain amount of money to the government, and how we decide how much money that is a complicated calculation. The United States has one of the most complicated tax codes on the planet, though not one of the highest tax rates on the planet, but a complicated method of figuring out what you owe the government. So, to libertarians, all taxes are theft. How is that? What is the logic behind taxes being theft? Well, to a libertarian, right, your money is your property, and you should not have to be forced to give it up, right? So it doesn't matter how you got your money. Maybe you worked really hard for it. If you worked for it, this is theft because it's basically stealing time from you, right? If you work at the movie theater for $10 an hour and you work 40 hours a week, right? And the government taxes you $10. Well, that's not so much, except that that's actually an hour's worth of work, right? So they've basically stolen an hour of your life. That's how you could think of that as theft. But maybe you didn't have to work for it. Maybe you inherited your money. Well, to a libertarian, that doesn't matter. It's still your money, however you got it. You're not allowed to steal money. That's property contract, that's property law. But however you have your money, it's your money. And the government shouldn't take it and spend it on whatever it wants. Because when you pay your taxes, you don't get to say, well, okay, here's my tax dollar, but I want it to be spent on education because I'm a pacifist and I don't want to support the army. That's not how that works. Or you can't say, well, I want to make sure my money goes to the army and not to building a road. That's the government takes it, dumps it into one big pile of money, and then doles it out to the programs it decides to fund. So to a libertarian, they would say, well, look, if you have money and you want to build a road, go for it. There shouldn't be a rule that you can't build a road. You should be able to spend your money how you want, build a road, go for it. But maybe you don't want to build a road, so the government shouldn't be able to take your money and build that road anyway, right? So hopefully that makes some sense here, that libertarians see taxes as theft and therefore bad, and so they want as few taxes as possible, okay? Just the bare minimum to support what two parts of the government? The small army and the court system for property law. Okay, well, that could sound great, especially to those of you who don't want to pay taxes. That sounds awesome. Okay, but what's the problem? I mean, obviously, societies around the world have taxes, and they have taxes for a reason. So what's the problem? Well, let's stick with our road example. Do places need roads? I mean, yeah, you need to get where you're going. Whether or not it's like with a cart or a bike or a car or whatever, a truck, you need to be able to deliver goods to and from places, to get businesses to work. Like, you need roads. So in a libertarian society, if the government isn't going to build the roads, does that mean there would be absolutely no roads? No, there could still be roads because, again, private citizens could build roads with their own money. But who is going to have the money to build a road? Wealthy people, right? Poor people can't afford to build a road. Roads cost millions of dollars. All these little roundabouts cost like $1 million to build, right? Okay, so there will be roads, but they'll be built by wealthy people. So that means, where are they going to go? where are you going to see roads and where won't you see roads? You're going to see roads in the nicer parts of town where the people have the money to build the roads. In the poorer parts of the town or the city, you're not going to see roads because people aren't going to have the money to build it. Doesn't mean they don't need them, but they don't have the money to build them. You could have a wealthy person decide to build a road in a place where he thinks a road is needed and just give it away. He could do that. Like, there's no rule saying he can't. They could also build a road and set it up as a business and make a toll road. So they'd build the road, but then they would charge people to use it. Right? So you would still have roads, but they'd either be in the nicer areas of town or they would be basically kind of private companies, toll roads. All right. So our two parts of government for a libertarian society. What does the government provide? It provides protection for the borders, and it provides a court system to adjudicate property law. So what does a libertarian government not provide? Anything else, basically, right? A whole host of things. So, for example, you would not have public schools or public education. Could you have schools and education in a libertarian government? Yes. Who would get the education? People who could afford it. Now, it's also possible you could have charities set up, private charities, maybe like churches or something that would educate some orphans for free, or I guess they don't have to be orphans. You could do that, but they could also discriminate if they wanted, right? If it's a religious school and it's a Christian school, they don't necessarily have to let Jewish kids into the school, right? Or vice versa. It's very unlikely you'd have enough of these for everybody to go, right? And private schools, you have to pay to go to a private school. So if you can't pay, you can't go, right? So you're not going to see everybody getting educated. That's a certainty. You would not have public infrastructure. Like I said, roads, you could have roads, but the government's not providing the roads, right? Public sewage. So we might be going back to like the 1700s and before, where you had people just dumping their waste in the streets. We talked about people walking through basically human excrement, right? Not great for public health. You wouldn't have any sorts of regulations for clean air, clean water, anti-pollution laws, or funds or programs to clean up toxic spills. If a company had intentionally was dumping like waste into a river, or accidentally there was a spill, some sort of catastrophe, or like a nuclear power plant blew up or something, there's no government action to clean that up. So either the company manages to clean it up, or they just pick up and move to a different location. Okay? There's definitely no healthcare. So, I mean, there's healthcare if you can pay for it, but if you're too poor, you don't get to go to the doctor. And this is how things were actually up until 1986 in the United States. If you couldn't pay, you didn't get healthcare, and like even emergency rooms didn't have to treat you. So, even if you were like, it's an emergency, they didn't have to treat you. Right? So people will die without that healthcare. Police and fire departments, right? You could have private security forces. You could have wealthy people hiring security guards to protect their areas. But the police as like a public service isn't going to exist. Fire departments. You could have companies whose job it is to put out fires for a profit. But like a public fire department, you wouldn't have. So you could have these services in the forms of private businesses that are looking to make a profit. But in that case, you have to be able to pay for them yourself. If you want their services, or you could have charities. But again, charities can discriminate, right? You could have privately run homeless shelters or schools or soup kitchens handing out money or handing out things to the poor. But they could discriminate. They could say, well, if you're gay, we're not going to serve you. Or if you have brown eyes, we're not going to serve you. Or if you're this kind of religion, we're not going to serve you. Like that would all be totally legal, because a libertarian government would say, well, it's the charity's money, so they get to decide how and who to spend it on. And so you can't tell them that they have to serve minorities, right? Because it's their money. So if they only want to serve white people, then that's fine, okay? So there you have an kind of an ideal libertarian government. Now, we've never completely seen a totally libertarian government. But in the 17 and 1800s, we got sort of close, or this is the closest we've really seen in history to what would constitute a libertarian government even though libertarianism isn't a thing yet, like it doesn't exist as an official like political movement, it's just kind of the natural development of how society is evolving at this time, where capitalism's coming into the fore. So you have wealthy people, you've got these big businesses, you have technology, you have big government states, like you have states that are big enough to actually control a fair amount of territory. And yet you still don't have these kinds of public sector help, like welfare, public school, healthcare. These governments at this time, like Britain and France and the United States, they do have big armies. Well, the United States doesn't have a huge army, but like because they're building empires, they do have armies that are much bigger than libertarians would like, right? So again, it doesn't quite 100% line up. But the other component where they're not providing these other services, that is in keeping with this. So even fire departments at this time were privately run. In the United States, it actually kind of depended where you were, but in a lot of parts of Europe and the United States, they were privately run. So what that meant was you had different companies, Fire Company A and Fire Company B. And you could choose to sign up as a subscriber and pay like a monthly fee. And they would give you a plaque that would say like Fire Company A, and you'd put it on like a post outside your home. And you'd pay every month. And if your house caught fire, the fire departments would show up. And if Fire Company A got there and they'd see this plaque, they'd say, oh, they're our customer, and they would put out the fire. Great. What would happen if Fire Company B showed up and saw Fire Company A's plaque? Would they put out the fire? No, you're not one of their customers. But they'd stick around in case your neighbor was Fire Company B's subscriber, and then, they would make sure to protect their customer's house. Let's say you paid Fire Company A every month for years, but then you missed a payment last month, and so you were no longer a subscriber, and then your house caught fire. Would they put out the fire? No, because you're no longer one of their customers. This is a for-profit business. Now, this might sound terrible from a human standpoint, right? Because you're just letting somebody's house burn. But from a business standpoint, why would it not make sense to put out fires for people who aren't your customers? Because then nobody would be a customer until their house actually caught fire, right? They would only pay for that month. Like, oh, thanks, you already put my house out, so here you go, right? Here's some money. But you can't stay in business that way, right? So you need to have a constant income of money. You got to pay your firemen. You've got to keep the hoses and all that. You need resources. So from a business standpoint, this makes sense. But from a human standpoint, we look at this and we're like, that's horrible. How can you let a family's house burn? And this is actually still the way fire departments operate in very rural areas in the United States. This happened several years ago where a family, the parents had lost their jobs. They no longer were paying the subscription to the fire department, and their house caught fire, and the fire department let it burn. I can't remember if it was in Tennessee or Kentucky, but it was a rural part of the state. So, okay, this is where we're getting into is this libertarian idea of what this would look like. And we're going to stop there for today because that's a pretty good stopping point. And we're going to pick up here next week because we're not done with this. We got to look at what this does in terms of the economy and people's status in society. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk soon.